to Elmhurst, our community, the EOC. I'm Ken Bartels, your host, and we're coming to you from the business zone of the Community Bank of Elmhurst. This is our second season, episode number 5. And I have with me Rich Reichert, President and CEO of the Community Bank of Elmhurst. But we're actually not going to talk about the bank today. Rich, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Ken.
You're very familiar with
the place.
program. Did you?
Yeah, I
I'll
did.
bet. I have no doubt. I wanted to interview you, and I've shared this with you, but I wanted to interview you about another passion of yours, something you've shared with me a great deal. But for our audience, you do a podcast called E-Town Lowdown, which would be Elmhurst E-Town Lowdown, obviously. And it's a pretty interesting thing for somebody just to decide to do. And I've thought that from the very beginning. So I want to start with, when did you get the idea, and was there a long time between the idea and the actuality?
Well, back in October of 2017, my wife and I were taking my daughter on a trip to see a college, University of Iowa in Iowa City, and I was talking to my good friend Paul Cook, who's the general manager of Larry Roche Chrysler Jeep Dodge Ram here in Elmhurst, and he said, do you guys, when you go on trips, do you ever listen to podcasts to kill the time? And I said, I've heard of podcasts. I used to consider myself a techie and with it, but I don't really know what a podcast is. So he gave me a few suggestions, and on the way out to Iowa City, we listened to a couple of podcasts, and I was hooked and still am on podcasts. I did a little radio back in college when I was at Purdue University, and I was never good. I had a face for radio, but I didn't even have a voice for radio, but I enjoyed doing it. So I sat and thought about it for a couple of weeks and thought, I'd really like to do this myself. So I reached out to a good friend of mine, Bob Robertson Jr., who was passionate about Elmhurst the way I was, and asked him if we were to start a podcast that was Elmhurst-centric, only people that had Elmhurst ties, would he be interested in being my partner? And he said, let me think about it. And Bob's a great guy, and who's since passed, which you'll hear about a little later.
Right.
But he was a little nervous that he would become the brunt of my jokes. So he came back to me a couple weeks later and said, sure, I'll be your partner, but I can't be the brunt of your jokes. And this is going to be a 50-50 partnership. There's no money in this. This is only outflow, no inflow. We don't get advertisers. We just do it for fun.
One of those.
Right. So we did our research over the next month or so, figured out what resources we'd need, what equipment we would need, how we would edit these things, what guests we would have, and then had to figure out how to get it hosted on the net and on Apple iPhones and on the Android Google Play Store. So we did our research, and beginning of January of 2018, we started this endeavor.
And who was the guinea pig for the first one?
Well, our first episode was basically a mission episode where we talked about our mission. But our first actual guest was our good friend Scott Lamort, who leads the Elmhurst Armpit Orchestra and the Elmhurst St. Patrick's Day Parade every year. And he had an interesting story about how he raised some money for Down syndrome. His daughter Emma has Down syndrome, and on his 40th birthday or thereabouts a number of years ago, he decided he was going to travel all of Route 66 and try to raise money for Down syndrome, which he did.
Right.
So he told us that story, and it was a great story.
So, technology aside, what's involved equipment-wise? You mentioned getting the equipment, but what is the equipment?
Well, the equipment is mostly a mixer or two, sound mixer that is. There's no video. Again,
Right.
We have faces for radio, so why bring video into this? And some podcasts, by the way, are video podcasts. So it's all audio, so we needed some mixers, some microphones, some mic stands, headphones, ways to distribute the signals through the headphones and adjust levels. We initially invested in a small mixer that allowed 4 mics at a time, and later we invested in a mixer that allows 8 mics going at one time. And then we had to get software to record and edit onto a PC basically, or a laptop. And we ended up choosing a software that was open source and free, so that didn't cost us anything. But most of our costs were taken care of a couple of years ago. Now we have guest gifts. We give every guest an E-Town Lowdown coffee mug, and as my partner Paul Cook always says, suitable for all types of beverages. So most of our costs are behind us.
Yeah. Well, I think the technology piece, but so you had the idea and you turned it into reality. You teach yourself how to do the technical part, but I've also heard you talk about the editing piece. And so this is live. It's not live. It's taped and then fixed and then put out.
It's recorded, and I try not to use the word taped because tape
Right.
doesn't
Yep.
exist
You're right.
in our world, but we record it in advance, and generally it takes anywhere from 4 days to 2 weeks for me to edit it, and that's based on my schedule. The actual hours that go into the podcast are a lot more than just the length of the podcast. A short podcast that we've completed is about 45 minutes. A long one is closer to 2 hours, and we actually did one that was more than 2 hours, and we released it in 2 segments. But there are several hours worth of work doing research on our
Sure.
guests, because we want to make sure that we have a good idea of where this interview is going. So that takes quite a bit of time. We also have a little segment called the Mowdown, where we ask kind of rapid fire, mostly either or yes or no type questions to the guest, and that can last anywhere from 3 to 10 minutes depending on the guest and
Packers, Bears, Cubs,
that
Sox.
kind
Yeah,
of thing.
right.
Marianne Ginger's our favorite that we ask all the men. We don't ask that to the women, but we have that little segment. So we've got some stock questions, but we try to tailor those questions to the exact guest. So there's a little time put into that. We actually write a lead sheet for every show, so first you have to do the research, then you have to
Sure.
write it up, and we basically have a flow to the show so that it makes sense and it's not all over the place. And then after we are finished recording, then the editing comes, as you mentioned before. Right. And if it's an hour and a half finished product, it'll be about 3 times that amount of time in terms of editing and posting it to our website. So there's a lot of work. So a typical hour and a half show might have 8 to 10 hours worth of work involved with it.
Okay. You noticed I didn't bite on that Ginger Marianne thing.
No, there is a right answer, by the way.
But you might offer which Charlie's Angels. That might be good.
Oh, we've done that before, as a matter of fact.
So it's been a couple of years then you've been doing these.
Right.
So how many have you done so far?
We've done about 28 episodes, I believe, and we've had 26 different guests. We had the one episode where we kind of talked about our mission, and then we had the episode I mentioned that was more than 2 hours was with Mayor Morley. That was one of the early episodes we did, so we split that up into 2 episodes.
So I know it's not a fixed schedule. It's more of a, as you have time and as you identify an interesting guest that is, oh, I should have him or her on the podcast.
Right. It's tough because there are a minimum of 2 of us involved, sometimes 3 or 4 folks that work on that are regulars on our show, so to speak, and then the guest or guests. Occasionally there's more than one guest. And we're all busy professional people, so there are times when it's hard to schedule that. The first year, we did probably 1.5 shows on average per month. Last year, 2019, we did a little more than 1 a month, and right now we're on the 1 a month pace, and I think that's probably what we'll do going forward. We also want to find good guests that are interesting, and we do this for ourselves. I mean, that's
Sure,
really
exactly.
The mission of this is we love Elmhurst, we love Elmhurst stories, and we love sitting down and talking to folks that have great stories, whether they grew up in Elmhurst, whether they live here now, whether they work here. All these people made a difference in town. So we try to find really good guests that we think that we would like to talk to, and that's the number one mission. Number two, would other people like to listen to it also?
Well, I think too the nature of the podcast is because you can then access it anytime.
Right.
So the shelf life is arguably forever.
It is, and what we find is, we don't get a lot of listens. A typical episode will get between 150 and 200 folks listening to it. We've got one that's up around 300 listens, but they're out there forever. And every once in a while, somebody will listen to an old episode, and I'll get an update that somebody did that. The other thing that I find is, I love video, and the whole world loves video, but there's something about the old radio interview, and you really get into a person's soul when you listen to their voice and you try to imagine their passion for what they do or what they did. And most people, once you get them going, they're a little nervous at first. They wonder what this is all about and what our ulterior motive is. Yeah. But once they get going, they get comfortable, and they tell us some stories that are sometimes just amazing.
Yeah, I did some radio earlier in my lifetime too, and it was mostly sports, but you have a different intimacy in radio than you have with video and what we're doing here. At the same time, these programs are on YouTube, and the same thing happens. I'll check YouTube periodically and find out that somebody went back and watched the first episode. This is our fifth. We're not at 28 yet, but.
Right.
So is there, you certainly script out your shows and do your research, but is there a format to the podcast? Is there an order you like to do?
There is, and it's funny, I generally do the lead sheets. Occasionally one of my partners will or would. What I'd like to do first of all is kind of find out our guest's story. Where did you grow up? What makes you who you are? Tell us about your parents, any siblings you might have, interests you had as a kid, and what you saw yourself doing for a career when you were a kid, which might not be at all like what you actually ended up doing, where you got your education, if you had formal education, what you thought that would lead to, what it actually led to, how that path may have changed, how others have influenced your life, not just your parents, but any mentors you may have had early on. So we try to get that kind of a base first, and it depends on the actual person and what angle we're trying to get. But then a lot of the folks have had long careers in Elmhurst, so we try to find out about how that career evolved, how they came here, how they prepared themselves to come here if they didn't grow up here, or if they flew the coop, so to speak, and left Elmhurst, what made them go elsewhere and find success. So then we do the whole career. Why are we really here interviewing this person? What makes them interesting to most people in town? And then we try and finish up with what they're doing now. Tell us about your family, things like that, and hear what they like to do. So we try to really get a feeling for the person, which hopefully will help people understand why they are or were successful.
So you mentioned starting out with your friend, so who's been involved to this point in time?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, my good friend Bob Robertson Jr. was my partner in the beginning, and shortly after we started this, we were having a fresco with our good friend Paul Cook, and he said, I'd kind of like to be involved in this. That's the kind of thing that's right up my alley. He loves talking to people, getting to know people. So he said, sure, you can be our producer. Now, he always kids. He does very little of the production, but he'll provide snacks and beverages, and he's a great formulator of questions. I always say I'm working on the engineering of this thing while I'm trying to ask intelligent questions. Sometimes I'm so involved in the engineering and problems with that I may not be paying attention to the last thing the guest said. So Paul's there, with his fresca, and he asks great questions, and Bob was the same way. So we were the core of this thing, and Bob passed away, unfortunately, this past July. He had a recurrence of stomach cancer that he'd had 5 years previous, and it came on very quickly, and he was gone very quickly. So we continue forward, Paul and I, with this. We did a tribute episode to Bob, who we referred to as Robbie. And by the way, we use pseudonyms. I don't go by Rich, I go by Rick, and Paul Cook goes by PK. We've also got a couple other characters that have helped us along the way. In particular, the person I said was our first guest, Scott Lamort, he does a character called Slappy Sal, the half-Italian food critic. And we were sitting around one time noticing that many of our friends who had Italian fathers and non-Italian mothers talk about being Italian more than our friends that are full-blooded Italian do. So he decided he was going to do this Slappy Sal food critic, half Italian. His mom's Polish. He truly is half Italian. And he does a great job, and he reviews restaurants all around the area. When I say around the area, all in Elmhurst. And he's done 15 or 16 of those already. We also have our friend Ken Ebel from Ebel's Ace Hardware here in Elmhurst that started a little bit that is Clever Ken the Hardware Man. And he will, in a humorous sort of way, answer a posed question about home improvement or repair or something like that. So we've done that. And the other thing, Paul, or PK, he has a little bit he calls One Ponce a Time, because when his daughter was young, she didn't say once upon a time, she said one Ponce a time. So he tells a little Elmhurst history, and it's all factual based, but he kind of does it in a Mr. Rogers sort of voice to give it a little humor, because we're all about humor, and I think laughter's the best medicine for anything, and that's what we all believe. So he does that little bit, and recently we've added Dave Oberg, the director of the Elmhurst History Museum, who doesn't correct PK. PK says the story the way it is, but he adds to it. And Dave is just an incredibly outgoing person.
Absolutely.
That brings a lot of energy to that. So we've had a cast of characters.
Yeah. So how did you decide to do your podcasts from the top of a water tower?
Well, what better place to do it? Butterfield Park Water Tower, we just found out recently, is the shortest water tower in terms of number of ladder rungs up to the top.
Good to know.
All of the water towers in town, the three of them, one at St. Charles in 83. And
all
one
redone now.
Right, and the other one at Barron's Park. They're all the same mean height above sea level, but the base of them are at all different heights. So the Butterfield Park Water Tower was the shortest, and it was easiest for us to carry the hot tub up there.
That's good to know. Yeah, that's a visual image that you really should capture at some point. Yeah.
Well, we sort of have in our logo. You have to check that out.
Yeah. Well, we'll get that into the program. We're going to take a quick break. This is Elmhurst, Our Community. I'm talking with Rich Reichert about the E-Town Lowdown, his podcasts, and all the fun he's having with it. We'll be right back. The Community Bank of Elmhurst Business Zone has modern co-working space and a conference room free for our business customers. Visit the zone today at communityelmhurst.com. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender. Welcome back to the EOC, Elmhurst, Our Community. I'm Ken Bartels with Rich Reichert, the President and CEO of the Community Bank of Elmhurst, and we're talking about his podcast, the E-Town Lowdown. And with all the taping time and editing, I know taping time, with all the time spent and the editing and the actual program itself, how much time do you invest in each one of these podcasts, what do you think?
It's around 10 hours per podcast. But it's time that I really enjoy. I love preparing. I love doing interviews the most. And then the editing, sometimes by the time I'm finished editing, I'm ready to be finished with it, so to speak.
Or moving on to somebody
Right.
else.
Well, and even, each podcast has a photograph that identifies it. So sometimes that might even take me a half hour, 45 minutes to pick the right photo for that episode. And interestingly enough, it depends which platform you listen to the podcast on as to whether that picture even shows. Sometimes it's just our generic logo that shows, but I spend a lot of time finding what I think is the right picture.
So 28 and counting of podcasts. There have to be some, I'm sure they've all been memorable. There have to be some that stand out. You already mentioned a 2-hour one with the mayor that you turned into 2 programs, but just a couple, 2 or 3.
Sure. In particular, the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart is the one we did a couple episodes ago, which was our tribute episode to our friend Robbie, who passed away, as I mentioned earlier. We had some of his friends come in and give little anecdotes about him, and that was pretty therapeutic. So that's special in its own way. A couple of others that were really neat. Josi Maeda of Maeda Motors and the car wash on Spring Road here in town. Josi's got an interesting story about coming here from India, what's different about the United States and India. And his religion, if I'm not mistaken, is the oldest monotheistic religion in the world, called the Zoroastrian religion. And it's very interesting in and of itself. You can't become a Zoroastrian unless you're born into it. So you or I, if we wanted to, couldn't be one. That said, they have this mantra that I can't get out of my head ever since I interviewed Josi, and that is good thoughts, good words, good deeds. And gosh, if we could all live our lives that way, wouldn't this be a better world? So that's one that really, really connected with me and my podcast partners. A couple others I think of. One, my good friend Dan Roche. We had him on there for a very unique reason. His son Dylan has cystic fibrosis. And when Dylan was a very young boy and they found out that he had this terrible disease, there wasn't a lot of hope for Dylan to live a full life. Dan made it his mission, first of all, to give Dylan the best life he could give him while he was on this earth. And he also made it his mission to find a cure / way to live with this disease for his son and the others that are afflicted with cystic fibrosis. And through his efforts and many other folks' efforts, there are some drugs right now that are extremely effective. And as I sit here right now, Dan's son Dylan is expected to live a full life, and he's a healthy young man of 21. And I'll tell you what, we were there ready to cry because we know this kid, and we know the passion that Dan had to try and find a cure for this. And there's not totally a cure, but there are meds that allow some of these folks to live a full life. There's still some out there that have mutations in the gene that they're still working to fix, but that was an incredible story. Another episode that was very interesting that we did in the last 4 or 5 months, we had a gentleman named Bob Goldsboro on the program who grew up in town, and he's an author. He wrote for the Chicago Tribune for many years, and he was the editor of the Chicago Tribune magazine that was in on Sundays, and had a fascinating career as a newspaper person, writer, and he had a very interesting story about growing up in Elmhurst that none of us had ever heard before, and just was so neat. He worked at the cemetery, I believe it's called Mount Emblem, up on...
with the windmill.
Right,
Yep.
with a windmill up at Grand and County Line Road. And when he was in high school, during the weekends, he was actually stationed up in the window of the windmill with binoculars. And as cars entered or exited the cemetery, he would try and check out their license plate numbers and write the license plate numbers down. And the reason is they would have their marketing staff during the week, their regular seasoned marketing staff, find out who these cars belong to, because there was a lot less privacy regulations in place then. So you could actually find out who those cars are registered to. And these people would actually call these people to try and sell them grave sites and plots. And I just thought that was a fascinating story. And we were imagining trying to help Bob craft his next novel. He's written a lot of novels, including the continuation of the Rex Stout novels.
Nero Wolfe.
Nero Wolfe, right. And we tried to imagine a new plot where some little girl goes to the cemetery with mom and dad on a Sunday to go to grandma's grave, and she notices this man with binoculars up in windmill and says, "Mommy, Daddy, there's a strange man up there." And then, of course, he pulls away to write down a license plate. They don't see him, and they think their kid's imagining something. So we were trying to feed him in his next story. I'm not sure he bid on it, though.
Yeah, Bob's a fascinating guy. He's had an incredible career. Maybe a couple more?
Sure. One that comes to mind is we interviewed the lady who was the president and CEO of Elmhurst Memorial Hospital, Pam Dunley. And Pam's a very professional, nice, buttoned-down sort of a personality. And until you really ask certain questions, you don't get to know somebody. Well, Pam came on the show, and we asked her about her hobbies. And of all things, her hobby is watching UFC fighting. UFC fighting is pretty violent, pretty crazy, but she is completely into it. And who knew? And when people share stories about what they're really into in life and their interests, you really get to know the person in a different light. So as buttoned down and professional as she can be, she's a fun person, and she likes to watch her UFC fights. Another fun episode is we actually recorded an episode in front of a live audience at Elmhurst Brewing Company about almost 2 years ago now. And we had about 50 people in the audience for that. And we were interviewing the folks at Elmhurst Brewing, being the first brew pub in town where they brew their own beer right on site. Not the first brewery in town, but the first brew pub. So we interviewed the founders, the owners, the chef, and the brewmaster, I guess. I almost said brewmeister.
Just as an aside, live audience, no audience, which is better from your perspective?
Well, it's interesting you ask that because I want to make another point. Live audience put a lot of pressure on us, and that's when I mentioned earlier that we upgraded from a 4-mic mixer to an 8-mic mixer. We actually had 7 mics going at once that night, and it was a bit of a nightmare to get the sound in the room and not get feedback into the mics. So we had to work really, really hard. None of us are sound engineers. Today you have a staff of professionals that make sure your show comes off great and they know what they're doing. We don't know what we're doing. It's just we're amateurs. So that was a little tough. And then we've got the pressure of this audience. And I think we pulled it off well for the most part. It was a lot of fun. That said, one of my biggest nightmares is we're asking a professional, busy person to come spend about 2 to 2.5 hours with us for this interview. And I'm always afraid we're going to have technical problems either on the spot or after the fact, and we're going to lose some of that. So that's my biggest fear, is to take time out of their schedule. We did have one technical difficulty with one of our shows. We did a show up at the Brew Point Coffee Roastery with Angelo and Melissa. And we had one segment of the hour and a half that was about 15 minutes where the sound quality was very poor. And I just felt horrible. It's there, you can hear it, but it's not great. So that's I'm always terrified of. So we try to back everything up. We have extra equipment, and you should see us dragging this stuff. It's for a couple of amateurs. It looks like we know what we're doing, but we don't.
If you haven't shared it already, biggest surprise or the first one that comes to mind.
Oh, I have to think about that for a second. I think, one thing that was fun, and I don't want to say it was the biggest surprise, I will say we surprised the guest.
Okay.
So Pete Kruger, who's the publisher of the Elmhurst Independent, and his family were the publishers of the Elmhurst Press and Press Publications for many years. He has an interesting hobby, and on the surface it doesn't sound that interesting until you dig a little bit. He loves to water ski. So one of the things he does is he goes down to Florida once or twice a year, and he goes to a water ski park. Now, that in and of itself is not that unusual. But this water ski park doesn't have boats pulling you. It has some sort of machine that pulls you around this lake, which I just find fascinating. Well, we did our research, and we always try to get a little something on the guest. And I don't, at this point in time, remember the name of the water ski park, but we didn't know it for sure, but we did some research and found there was this water ski park in the area he went to. Sure enough, we nailed it. And we asked him a question about whether or not he'd ever heard of this place, and he just looked at us dumbfounded. he was so surprised that we had done that kind of research. And I think a lot of our guests are surprised at the research we do, and with the advent of the internet, it makes it pretty easy, but it does take a few hours each show.
Yeah. How long do you think you're going to do these?
Well,
I mean, I know you're doing them because you want to do them, but
right.
Are you any less enthusiastic about them? I guess that's a
Well,
better
a little
question.
bit less enthusiastic since our founding partner, Bob, passed away. That said, Paul and I want to continue them, and we still enjoy talking to people. As long as we can find interesting guests that are willing to sit down with us, and we give them some incentive. We tell them whatever their favorite beverage is, we'll have some of that, and every once in a while you might hear some rocks sloshing around in a glass when we're interviewing. But as long as we can find good guests, I'd love to keep doing this as long as we can. And again, there's no profit motive, so
Right.
we have it costs us about $100 a year to maintain the site. That's our only ongoing costs. So we can do this and have no listeners, and I certainly hope that doesn't happen. We're looking to expand our listenership, obviously.
Well, speak to that. If I want to find the E-Town Lowdown, what do I have to do?
Well, you've got a number of options. If you just want to do it on your desktop or your laptop, you can type in E-Town Lowdown, all one word, .podbean, PODBEAN.com, and you'll find our site and links, and you can play it right on your PC. What I would suggest is if you have a smartphone, either an iPhone or an Android phone, you can use the podcast application, or the app as everybody calls it, that is provided with your phone, and search for E-Town space Lowdown. So E-Town's one word, Lowdown's another word. And that took a while for us to get listed on the Apple Podcast Store and on the Google Play Podcast Store.
Okay. Well, a couple of things as we get close to wrapping this up. Number one, for the audience, Rich is also the founder of the Elmhurst Armpit Orchestra, which was referenced in the first half of the show. And the patron saint of that group is Bill Murray. So I'm thinking, if you can get Bill to come for the St. Patrick's Day parade, which I know is always the goal, maybe you could podcast him too.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Ken, because we've actually invested in some mobile equipment too. Every once in a while, we need to do a short bit on the road or an interview. So we're ready for him. If he shows up, we will have our recording equipment there that day. If that should happen, it'll be a fun day in Elmhurst, I assure you of that.
I think so. I think that would be pretty amazing.
I think so too. And
across the
everybody
board.
thinks of him as kind of a lower level movie star, even though he's been in a lot of movies, but there's nobody that's more difficult to get to your event than Bill Murray. I mean, nobody. It'd be easier to get a former president, I think, at times.
So you're going to continue them, and the format is, the interesting Elmhurst-based people. I'm thinking I may contact Paul and say, we need to turn the tables on Rich, and we'll podcast you.
Yeah, well, I'm not that interesting. I'll tell you that much.
Well, I beg to differ. Well, thank you very much. The Elmhurst podcast, E-Town Lowdown, going across all the invisible waves that surround us in the universe. So, thank you for joining me. You're also the inspiration for this show, in case nobody knew that. So,
well, thank you.
This has been Elmhurst, Our Community, and we're coming to you from the Community Bank of Elmhurst. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Rich, and we'll see you all again. The Community Bank of Elmhurst Business Zone has modern co-working space and a conference room free for our business customers. Visit the zone today at communityelmhurst.com. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.